Where does the history of humanity begin? From what point do we start counting? And where does the history of civilization actually begin? First, let's agree on what we mean by civilization. Civilization is a way of organizing space. Objectively speaking, civilization as some independent phenomenon doesn't really exist. It's a term, and different people put very different meanings into what civilization actually is. In today's lesson, in today's video, we'll agree on one working definition. We'll call civilization a way of organizing social space that has several clear characteristics. First, it's a large number of people, more than nature itself would normally allow. Second, it's large projects. Construction. Massive projects that can only be carried out when there are a lot of people involved, what we usually call monumental construction. Things that remain even after societies and civilizations themselves disappear. The societies are gone, but the results of their activity, these monumental projects, stay behind, and we can study them and think about what they mean. Another key feature is writing. Large human communities leave behind very concrete things that carry information, even long after those societies no longer exist. And of course, civilization is also about transforming nature. A productive economy, a situation where humans no longer adapt themselves to nature, but instead adapt nature to themselves in a way that is convenient for them so that nature functions around them. For example, we no longer just gather random nuts and plants, we deliberately grow them. We don't only hunt and adjust our lives to the movements of gazelles. We start breeding animals, breeding goats, and they travel with us, with people wherever it's convenient for us. We change the course of rivers. We create irrigation systems, and so on. And then there is probably the most important factor of civilization, one that actually follows from everything I've just mentioned. This factor is hierarchy, in other words, inequality. The result of inequality is that some people appear who are no longer directly involved in survival. They begin to devote part of their time, or all of it, to management, to war, to science, to the development of writing, to the development of art, and so on. All of these things are interconnected. Civilization is not some simple linear step-by-step process. It's the interaction of many different factors. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today. And this is why I want to start with this image and go back very, very far, back to the time of anthropology. From an evolutionary perspective, as representatives of the genus Homo, we were successful. And we succeeded largely thanks to things that, later on, civilization taught us to do ourselves. In a sense, we took evolution into our own hands. Of course, that brought a number of advantages, and also a number of side effects. But what I want to show here is this continuity, what humans began to do through civilization compared to what humans did in a pre-civilizational state. Our idea of hominid evolution, and of our relatives in general, has largely become outdated. For example, this very picture used to hang in my biology classroom when I was in school. The idea of a linear development of civilization and of humans was considered valid, maybe up until the 1950s, but of course, humans did not develop the way that picture shows, neatly, step by step, in one single direction. Evolution was not linear, and it didn't look like that at all. It was much closer to something like a tree, with many branches and a huge number of different paths. Human evolution is not some kind of directed process that inevitably led to us. So perfect and beautiful. That image reflects a way of thinking typical of the 19th century. And even in the early 20th century, up until the 1950s, such an idea could still be considered reasonable, or at least somewhat scientific. Today, of course, everything has changed. In reality, evolution doesn't work that way. It works in all directions at once. At every stage, there existed a large number of different variants, and each of these variants developed and evolved in its own way. Visually, it's not a single straight line with sequential stages. but something much closer to a branching structure like this. And it's very important to understand that at every stage there are many branches that lead into completely different specializations. You may have heard of a test that exists online, the chimpanzee test. Humans perform much worse on it than chimpanzees. In this test, you need to memorize and press a certain number of buttons in a specific sequence. Chimpanzees handle this task far better than humans do. People cannot pass this test without special mnemonic techniques. While chimpanzees cope with it quite easily, humans start forgetting the sequence after 5 or 6 elements, whereas chimpanzees can calmly handle 10 or even 15. For humans, remembering 10 or 15 elements without tricks simply doesn't work. The same applies to the structure of our hand. Saying that the opposable thumb and other features make the human hand uniquely progressive, and that everyone who doesn't have this feature is somehow less advanced, is simply wrong. That's not true. Progress is anything that moves forward. And if you end up on an island and you start to shrink, your brain gets smaller, your body gets smaller, and you turn into a small creature adapted to island life, that is not degradation. That is also progress. It means that in new conditions, many things became unnecessary. And that is exactly what progress is, adaptation to conditions. For example, today we know of excavated tribes on the islands of Indonesia. At some point they managed to sail there. Obviously they had means of traveling across water, such as hollowed out tree trunks. But over the course of several thousand years on those islands, they lost much of their knowledge and skills. Their material culture became far simpler, and they were no longer able to leave the islands. In island conditions, everything they had once known simply wasn't needed anymore. Over time, they forgot it and unlearned it. But this too is progress, a state in which people adapted to life in their environment. We won't spend too much time on this topic. I just want us to keep one thing in mind. Development did not go in a straight linear line. It spread out in all directions with many different possibilities. Why is this important for us today in this video? Because we will see exactly the same thing when we look at the development of societies. Many societies, in fact almost all of them, developed non-linearly as well. They had multiple possible paths of development and sometimes changed direction entirely, switching lines, branches, and scenarios along the way. Not all societies followed the familiar script. The invention of writing, the invention of metallurgy, the emergence of inequality, monumental construction, everything we usually imagine when we hear the word civilization. There were many societies that domesticated goats, and that was enough for them. They stopped there. There were societies that began farming, started growing crops, and settled into a sedentary way of life. But then something would happen. Insects might destroy the entire harvest, and they would abandon that settled place and return to a nomadic lifestyle, becoming herders again and giving up agriculture altogether. So there was never a single, universal, linear scenario for how civilization developed. At least if we think about how a school course usually presents this, let's briefly go over it. Several million years ago, around 7 million years ago, our ancestors slowly began to come down from the trees, or rather the trees began to disappear from under them. This means that the climate in Africa, where the earliest humans lived, became drier. Today, this is no longer in doubt. It was already suggested in the early 19th century that humans originated in Africa. And now, with hundreds and thousands of discoveries, there is no question about it, so the climate becomes drier. Many tropical forests turn into savannas, and savannas create entirely new conditions. Why do I find this important to talk about? Because it is precisely these new conditions that push and guide evolution in the direction that eventually led to us, sitting here today, watching a video on YouTube. So what exactly changes in these conditions? Large open spaces appear. People can no longer live and move only above ground. In the treetops, they have to come down. and down below, it's dangerous. Down there live all kinds of dangerous saber-toothed cats that can eat you without even noticing. In addition, the savanna has far fewer nuts and plant foods. People have to look for new sources of nutrition. You catch a ferret, you eat a ground squirrel. And of course, at this stage, those early humans who followed this evolutionary branch fed on carrion. They were small, physically weak, weaker even than modern humans. They were not at the top of the food chain, so scavenging was unavoidable. And it is at this point that humans begin consuming meat. At least meat becomes part of the diet, and the thing is, meat is extremely nutritious. It provides a huge amount of energy. And meat accelerates evolution. It delivers a massive amount of energy. And that energy has to be spent somewhere. And one place where it can be spent is the brain. So here is, in general, a simplified scheme of what we are talking about. Energy, of course, is spent on the development of muscle mass, bones, and the nervous system as well. But brain development requires far more energy than all of that. Even a tiny milligram of brain tissue demands much more energy than building muscle. And brain development was probably also stimulated by the fact that those very first early humans, fossil humans, found themselves in conditions where life became more dangerous. In the savanna, in open spaces, they needed communication. They needed some way to coordinate with each other. Millions of years ago, signals appeared. Primates, for example, have very specific signals: danger from above, danger from below. Humans have similar signals too, and that is what we call speech. Language seems to appear precisely during this period as a way to improve interaction within the group. And group interaction is the key to survival, first for early humans and later for all people. Of course, it's very sweet and nice to sit and groom each other's fur to show affection. But it's much more efficient to quickly say, I love you too. That simply works better. So the development of speech contributed to the evolution and growth of the brain, which does distinguish humans from other animals, but under no circumstances should we say or think that humans became more successful only because of brain development. You absolutely cannot say that. Even if we set brain development aside and do not take this evolutionary feature into account, humans still had their own unique specializations that were no less important. For example, the ancestors of the genus Homo lost their body hair very quickly. It's worth noting that humans never had an undercoat at all. This adaptation is called thermoregulation, and thanks to it, humans became extremely enduring. Across the savannas, because of this ability to regulate body temperature, humans, with their small, slightly clumsy legs, could run very long distances and became far more resilient. Everyone knows that in Africa there are animals that can move much faster than humans, gazelles, for example, or the fastest land animal on Earth, the cheetah. But after sprinting very fast over a short distance, these animals lose the ability to move at all. They overheat, they don't have the ability to regulate heat at such high temperatures, and they need time to recover. So a cheetah makes its lightning-fast run, catches its gazelle, and then lies there completely exhausted, unable to move. And then hyenas may come and take its prey simply because the cheetah has completely run out of energy. Because of the endurance that develops in humans, the ability to sweat properly without losing strength, humans gain a new advantage. They can exhaust animals that are much faster than they are, even animals like gazelles. A human starts running. The gazelle runs away, sees that the human keeps running, moves some distance away, and stops. The human keeps running. The gazelle thinks, wait, what? Runs another 500 meters. The human keeps running. The gazelle runs again. The human keeps running, and so on. Human endurance gives enormous advantages. Even today, there are still traditional hunter-gatherer tribes that hunt animals in exactly this way. So let's not forget our other strengths, and let's not say that the human specialization is only about the brain. Of course, the development of the hand and everything connected to it also made us specialists in throwing. What humans can do better than any other animal in the world is throw. This ability involves the rotation of the arm, the flexibility of the wrist, balance, a whole set of factors. And this, too, is something that fundamentally distinguishes humans from all other animals. I wanted to emphasize this once again, because we should remember. It's not only brain development that gives us these advantages and acts as the key factor in human evolution. We shouldn't forget that. All of these factors together, including the brain, eventually allow humans to begin making tools. But tools, or at least the use of tools, are not unique to humans. Some animals can also use tools. Even an elephant, for example, can pick up a stick and use it to perform some action. There are animals that can figure out how to use simple objects or adaptations. We are not alone in this. A well-known example is monkeys inserting a stick into an anthill and then licking it to eat the ants. However, this is the point where systematic tool-making begins, and this, in turn, contributes to the development of speech. Today, this is a well-established and proven fact. Fine motor skills stimulate and develop speech centers in the brain. For example, you sit and twist a Rubik's Cube, and speech centers in your brain become activated. So making tools with your hands, developing fine motor skills, directly contributed to the development of speech. And this is how a kind of synergy forms, an interconnection between all these factors, where one reinforces the other. More meat appears in the diet, which leads to faster brain development. The need for communication improves survival. Communication supports the development of speech and tool making. The transmission of knowledge about how to make tools further develops fine motor skills. Fine motor skills, in turn, stimulate speech. Speech allows for better coordination within the group and more effective hunting. Effective hunting leads to more food. And this closed loop, the interaction of all these factors, drives evolution forward. We should also include gestures in speech here. Even today, people convey emotional meaning through gestures. And in those distant times, this was a crucial factor for interaction and survival. It wasn't just some vague emotional expression. Hand motor skills, speech and communication are all very closely connected. Another critically important factor is the appearance of fire. Fire makes it possible to cook meat instead of eating it raw. In a sense, humans acquire external digestion. Digesting food requires energy, temperature, gastric juices, internal processing, and all of this consumes a great deal of energy. With the appearance of fire, when food is already pre-processed and easier to digest, humans gain even more energetic resources for development. Even more energy becomes available. And finally, we should say that at different times, different representatives of the genus Homo existed simultaneously. It wasn't the case that Homo erectus existed then disappeared, and only afterward Homo habilis appeared. Earlier Homo species continued to exist, spread across territories, and very often came into contact with each other. Different groups interacting with one another. Interestingly, the size of these groups remained roughly the same for hundreds of thousands of years. About 20 to 30 individuals. Sometimes the question comes up, at what point did the division into races occur? And this is actually a difficult question to answer. But imagine that with all this diversity, even back then, in ancient times, all these groups already had racial differences. To this day, scientists still argue about whether the remains we find belong to different species or whether they are representatives of the same species but of different races. The only thing we can say with certainty is that races change much faster than species. For example, people develop darker skin quite quickly after losing body hair. Once hair disappeared, natural selection began favoring those who could better tolerate long exposure to the sun and avoid sunburn. Nothing else was protecting humans from direct sunlight anymore, so a natural form of protection started to develop. Darker skin. Now let's talk about hunting. Of course, humans hunted relatively small animals. The surrounding fauna at that time consisted of huge, powerful, often terrifying creatures, megafauna. Hunting such animals with primitive tools was extremely difficult. Imagine trying to hunt something like that with a simple spear, or without a spear at all. The idea that people used to gang up and kill mammoths together is actually a misconception. In evolutionary terms, that kind of organized mammoth hunting happened yesterday, relatively speaking. About 30,000 years ago, which is a very short period on an evolutionary timescale, but gradually group interaction improved. Communication became more effective. Skills, tools, and speech developed. And from here, we can move toward modern humans, toward the beginning of history and civilization. At some point in East Africa, Homo sapiens appears. And it's important to understand that everything changes very slowly. Imagine selection working on something like a slightly longer thumb, or on who speaks better. And by the way, this is also sexual selection. The development of speech is most likely directly connected to sexual selection. A person who speaks well, who can approach someone confidently and say, hey, has a better chance of leaving offspring. Humor probably comes from the same place. There is also a theory that our tendency toward gossip begins around this time as well. Clearly, speech played a huge role in sexual selection. Selection favored those who were quicker thinkers and better at expressing emotions, thoughts, and desires. So what happens is that selection promotes larger brains and the development of many different abilities. We mentioned that the ability to spread the right rumors may have helped create group cohesion, form leadership roles, and organize stronger social groups. And don't forget that selection works in both directions, not only toward choosing a strong, intelligent man, but also toward choosing a strong, intelligent, quick-minded woman. From an evolutionary perspective, it turned out to be advantageous to be a smart man and a smart woman. Of course, if you can only talk beautifully but can't actually do anything, if you're weak and incapable of action, you won't survive in such a society either. But we should not underestimate the role of speech, intelligence, and quick thinking in sexual selection and in the development of civilization. So when does the modern human actually appear? This is a very good question, or rather, a very difficult one. The problem is that changes become noticeable only over very long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands. If we ask when a person like us appears, someone like you and me, and look at it strictly from an anthropological point of view, then we usually say around 200,000 years ago. But even here, it's not guaranteed that this was a fully modern human in every sense, because we don't actually know what was happening with the brain at that time. We don't know how brain evolution was unfolding, and we don't know what kind of thinking these people had. Most likely, it differed from the thinking of modern humans today. Anthropologically, based on key physical indicators like the skull, bones, and skeletal structure, we can place this appearance at around 200,000 years ago. But reconstructing the structure of the brain is still impossible. Making confident assumptions is also difficult, because we don't fully understand how brain evolution works. For example, there are observations today suggesting that the human brain may actually be getting smaller. One theory explains this by saying that the brain is simply being used more efficiently, so a larger volume is no longer necessary. After all, there are animals whose brains are larger in volume than a human's, yet they are not more intelligent. So judging intelligence purely by skull size or estimated brain volume doesn't really work. I don't want to dwell too much on biology here, and that's why I'm moving on to a topic often called mitochondrial Eve. The point is that we are all related, both through the female line and the male line. Along the female line, mitochondria are inherited. This is probably familiar to anyone who has done one of those modern DNA tests. You take a test, and it tells you who your ancestors were. You've most likely heard about this. There's an interesting pattern here. Maybe those of you who've taken such tests can confirm it. The further back you go into the past, the higher the chance of finding some famous people among your ancestors. This happens because populations used to be much smaller, and not everyone who lived in the past left descendants. Just like today, not everyone alive now will leave offspring. So if you trace lineages far enough back, statistically speaking, you eventually reach a point where it becomes absolutely clear that we all share a common female ancestor. This doesn't mean she was the only woman alive at the time. She lived roughly 150,000 to 140,000 years ago, and she lived in Africa. This is now firmly proven, not only archaeologically but genetically as well. In the modern world, Africa has the greatest genetic diversity among human populations. The idea is that this original Eve, called mitochondrial Eve, passed her genes down through her descendants. And over generations, each branch of her descendants continued to have offspring, so that eventually every one of us carries those genes. She lived a very long time ago, of course, but in a sense, we are all extremely distant cousins, thousands of times over. And this is one way of marking the appearance of the modern human, by identifying the time when mitochondrial Eve lived. Is this method better than marking the appearance of an anthropological human 200,000 years ago? Not really. In the end, it isn't better or worse. It's just another way of looking at the same question. And we also have the Y chromosome. And there is what's known as Y chromosomal Adam. That means that along the male line, all humans also share a common ancestor. He has no direct relation to the common female ancestor, but in a similar way over time, his genes displace the genes of all other male lines. He is younger than mitochondrial Eve. He lived roughly around 90,000 years ago. And just try to imagine this. Over the course of 90,000 years, his descendants in every generation managed to leave behind at least one descendant of their own. And as I already mentioned, the world today can be divided into Africa and the rest of the world. Africa has the greatest genetic diversity among humans, which very strongly supports the idea that humans originated in Africa and spread outward from there. So how did people leave Africa? Well, obviously there were no walls or barriers. Most likely it happened in a completely natural way. And it was probably connected to hunting. For example, people hunted certain animals. Those animals moved on for various reasons, and people followed them in order to continue hunting. That's how migration likely happened. So if we want to name a conditional date for the appearance of modern humans in East Africa, we can say about 100,000 years ago. This number works as a compromise between mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. It's easy to remember, and it works well as a symbolic date for the appearance of modern humans. These people already looked like us, and it seems very likely that they already thought in ways similar to how we think today. The next major factor that pushed their evolution forward was glaciation. Around 100,000 years ago, the last ice age begins, and roughly during this period, humans start spreading and occupying a fairly large area of West Africa, and later Southeast Africa as well. This expansion is very clear and is well supported by archaeological findings. When we talk about much earlier periods millions of years ago, the number of discoveries is counted in the hundreds. But for this period, around 100,000 years ago, the number of finds increases dramatically into the thousands and thousands. This allows us to draw many conclusions about how these people lived, how they spread, how they settled. We can also infer what kinds of activities they were engaged in, and it becomes clear that they were already thinking in ways very similar to us, not just looking anthropologically modern, but also behaving cognitively like modern humans. The Ice Age begins and it coincides with some very interesting changes. The geography of the planet looks quite different from what we're used to today. Huge areas are covered by ice sheets. The Persian Gulf does not exist. The English Channel does not exist. Sea levels are much lower. And by the way, this is exactly why humans were able to reach Australia relatively quickly, because of land bridges formed due to lower sea levels. Of course, when we talk about all of this, we should never forget that there were many branches of human evolution, and a huge number of them simply went extinct. Today, we speak from the future, looking at our own branch and say, we survived, we made it. We're smart. But in reality, this was just one of many possible scenarios. It was largely a matter of chance that our particular branch survived. Many other human species and evolutionary branches did not. By the way, this is exactly why the idea of linear evolution appears so often. We look back from the future, we see our own branch, and it feels like only this one ever existed, but that's not true. It's all, of course, a matter of chance. If we look at history from where we stand now, it can feel as if everything, starting from supernova explosions millions of years ago, meteorite bombardments, the entire history of the planet, the evolution of animals, and eventually civilization, all existed so that you and I could sit here today, warm and comfortable, far away from each other, and study history. But that's just how perspective works when you look backward. Now, let's talk about whether people lived in caves. This question comes up a lot. It's a very common misconception, reinforced by illustrations and popular images. In reality, people did not live in caves. If you live in a cave and light a fire inside, you would simply suffocate. Caves were used as shelters to hide from bad weather, from wild animals, and so on. People lived in the savannah. In Africa, it's actually quite difficult to even find a cave. You really have to try. So why do we find so many human remains in caves? That's where the misconception comes from. Archaeologists have a well-known joke that ancient people settled along modern highways. The joke means that when modern roads or subway lines are built, ancient human remains are often discovered. The same logic applies to caves. Remains are simply preserved much better there. People didn't live in caves, but imagine a dark cave where someone moves inside with a small torch, or even in complete darkness. There's a crack in the ground and the person falls into it, because preservation conditions are so good. Over hundreds of thousands of years, many people ended up there. That's why when something is found in a cave, it's often well preserved, abundant, and layered. Scientists can observe changes over time, anthropological development, physical differences, and so on. For modern researchers, this is a huge scientific gift. For the people who fell in, of course, it was tragic. There are caves, for example, in Tanzania, where many finds have been made. But again, this is simply because remains were preserved there more easily. In the savannah, remains decay much faster, so there are far fewer discoveries. A great number of discoveries also come from the Middle East. Why? Because there is such a phenomenon as biblical archaeology. People who are interested in this topic invest money into excavations, into searching for historical confirmation of certain narratives. As a result, the Middle East is extremely rich in archaeological finds. Because of this, we have remarkable discoveries from places like the Negev desert. Based on these finds, we can build almost a precise chronology. 60,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. From these materials, we can observe how tool-making techniques developed. We can trace changes and diversity in tools almost down to a 1,000-year scale, and even build hypotheses about how these tools were used. There are also very curious finds. For example, tools that clearly weren't meant to be used as tools at all. They look like fire strikers or scrapers, but they are enormous, giant versions that would be extremely impractical to use. It's not entirely clear how to explain this, but there is a very strong hypothesis, one that I personally find quite convincing, that this is again connected to sexual selection. In this case, a man could demonstrate that he had such a tool, that it was reliable, impressive, and therefore that he himself was a good choice. someone safe to choose, someone with whom it made sense to have children. A way for a woman to select him among others. Another interesting discovery dates to roughly the same period. About 100,000 years ago, the body louse is genetically different from the louse that lives in human hair. Fabrics and clothing themselves, of course, did not survive. But the genes of the body louse are found in archaeological material. And this already tells us that people were making clothes. And look how neatly everything fits together in time. Around 100,000 years ago, the Ice Age begins. It gets colder, and apparently this is when humans start making clothing. At roughly the same time, stone tools are being processed with such skill that we see the appearance of spear points. And a spear point is a much more interesting step forward. It's already a new stage. Of course, you can cut and stab with it, and that's impressive in itself. But most importantly, it dramatically increases hunting efficiency. Because if you attach such a point to a stick, you no longer have to try to kill an elephant or a mammoth with your bare hands. At the very least, you can try to poke it from 2 meters away. It would still be extremely difficult, of course. The easiest option would be to wait until a mammoth wandered into a swamp, got stuck there, and then hunt it. But even so, the ability to affect animals from a distance completely changes hunting methods. If hunting very large animals was still unsafe and inefficient, then hunting medium-sized or smaller animals with spears became quite realistic. And that means more meat, more food, and therefore more opportunities for further development, including brain development and all those interconnected abilities we've already talked about. Humanity moves one step closer to civilization. Everyone has seen those classic images of ancient hunts, where traps are always shown. But what we can say for sure today is that fire was already being used as a hunting tool. Forests were deliberately set on fire to drive animals out. And when animals run out of a burning forest in panic, hunting frightened prey becomes much easier. Of course, in those ancient times there was no way to preserve meat for later use. The best survival strategy for hunter-gatherers was always to eat everything right away, here and now. At most, you might share with your group. For example, if you came across a date palm, the most sensible survival strategy was to eat everything on the spot, the entire tree. Because if you didn't, your group would move on. Other groups would find that tree later, and you would never come back to it. The most you could do was gather the food and share it among the members of your group, women and children. So if you ever wake up at night, walk to the fridge and feel like eating everything you see, just know that it's not your fault. That's evolution. Even gathering and eating something like dates required time and learning. You had to learn how to determine ripeness and safety. You had to recognize what could be eaten, when it could be eaten, how not to poison yourself, whether it was useful or tasty. All of this took a huge amount of time. These processes were slow, very slow. In the later stages of the Stone Age, when bows already existed, when people used throwing spears and when humans had learned to unite into 2 or 3 groups for hunting, when they could build traps, set up ambushes, and hunt together as a coordinated group, it is at this stage that we begin to see clear evidence in the archaeological record. From the remains of dwellings, from what they ate, from bone remains, we can see that at this point people were already hunting megafauna. Only by uniting and using these kinds of hunting tools were they able to reach that level. Although in general, feeding on megafauna is not actually the best strategy, deer are the optimal size for hunting. Deer and animals like them. This is the ideal balance between size, aggressiveness, and the amount of food obtained, allowing humans to avoid excessive risk while still getting enough nutrition. So today we've covered a fairly large period and reached the point where humans had already learned to cooperate in groups, hunt effectively, communicate with one another, and build their first simple shelters. I'm grateful to everyone who listened today and learned a little more about human history. In the next video, we'll continue and talk about the very first animal that humans domesticated, and we'll keep exploring history and how civilization was formed. Thank you all, and see you next time. So we stopped at the moment when people had already learned to hunt effectively, unite in groups, build primitive dwellings. This was approximately 30,000 years ago. It would seem that everything is clear from here. People gradually transition to agriculture, then begin to build cities, writing appears, civilization, right? Well, not quite. History, as always, turns out to be much more interesting and complex than we thought. And today I want to tell you about one place that completely overturned our ideas about how everything actually happened. This place is called Göbekli Tepe. And if you've never heard of it, no problem. Most people haven't heard of it, but believe me, this is one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries in human history. Imagine Turkey, not far from the city of Şanlıurfa, a hill, an ordinary hill, of which there are thousands in that area, 15 meters high, 300 meters in diameter. Local farmers had used it for their needs for centuries, dug up stones that interfered with plowing, piled them up. No one thought that something special was hidden under this hill. In the early 1960s, an American archaeologist noticed this hill. He suggested that there might be a Byzantine cemetery there, something relatively recent, by archaeological standards, a couple thousand years. Not very interesting. And so this place remained, just a hill with a supposed Byzantine cemetery, until 1994. In 1994, a German archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, came there. And Schmidt, unlike his American colleague, looked at the stone sticking out of the ground and immediately understood. This is not a Byzantine cemetery. This is not that time at all. This is much, much older. He saw T-shaped pillars, huge stone blocks with traces of processing, and realized he had found something incredible. Excavations began. And with each day, with each new layer of earth that archaeologists removed, it became increasingly obvious they had stumbled upon something completely unique. Under this hill was hidden a temple complex, enormous, the most ancient of all known temples in the world. Its age is 12,000 years, maybe even more. 12,000 years, can you imagine? This is 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. This is 6,500 years older than Stonehenge. This is older than Sumerian cities, older than everything we're accustomed to considering the beginning of civilization. And here's what's most striking. When archaeologists began studying this complex, they realized that it was built not by the people we're used to imagining as temple builders. It was built by hunter-gatherers. Think about it. Hunter-gatherers, people who didn't yet know agriculture, who didn't grow wheat, didn't breed goats and sheep. They still wandered through forests and savannas, hunted wild animals, gathered wild plants. And yet, they built this. Before the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, all scientists were certain of one simple sequence. First, people transition to agriculture, then they have a settled lifestyle, then resources accumulate, inequality appears, social hierarchy, and only then, when society is already sufficiently complex and organized, do monumental structures appear. Temples, palaces, pyramids. All logical, right? First food, then everything else. But Göbekli Tepe showed that everything was completely different, or at least not always like that. Here, everything is reversed. First appeared the temple, huge, complex, requiring incredible efforts for construction. And then, only then, agriculture appeared. Moreover, there's a hypothesis, and it seems very interesting to me, that it was precisely the need to build and maintain this temple complex that pushed people to start growing wheat. Imagine, pilgrims come here, hundreds of people, maybe thousands. They need to be fed. Hunting and gathering is fine, but when you need to feed such a crowd, it becomes a problem. And so someone perhaps begins to specifically plant wild wheat that grows nearby to have a supply. And speaking of wheat, 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, on Mount Karakada, Wild wheat still grows, and genetic studies have shown that all our modern domesticated wheat originated from it. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. Let's try to imagine what this looked like. How could such a thing even happen? So people are living in small groups of 20, 30, maybe 50 people. They hunt, gather wild plants, move from place to place following herds of animals or in search of ripened fruits. The ordinary life of hunter-gatherers that continued for tens of thousands of years. And suddenly, bam, they start building a temple. Not a house. Not a shelter from rain. Not a pen for animals, which they don't have yet anyway. A temple. Why? What for? We don't know the exact answer, but we can try to guess based on what we know. At Göbekli Tepe, there are no traces of permanent habitation, no remains of houses, no kitchens, no garbage heaps with food scraps that usually remain where people live for a long time. This was not a settlement. This was a place where people came, a place of pilgrimage, a sanctuary. Archaeologists found a huge number of animal bones there. Bones of gazelles, wild bulls, wild boars. Thousands of bones, and all of them with traces of butchering, preparation. That is, they didn't just bring sacrifices here, they held feasts here. Large gatherings where they ate, drank, conducted some rituals. Imagine this, several times a year, maybe on certain days when the moon is in a certain phase or when a certain constellation appears in the sky, people from all around begin to flock to this hill. They walk for tens, maybe hundreds of kilometers. They bring game, plants, everything they could obtain. And there at the top of the hill, they meet with other groups, exchange news stories, perhaps trade, conclude marriages. And of course conduct some religious ceremonies. Because this place was sacred. Why sacred, we don't know. Maybe something important happened there in their mythology. Maybe ancestors were buried there. Maybe there was a special view of the stars from there. Speaking of stars, there's a version that Göbekli Tepe was not only a temple, but also an observatory. On one of the pillars, they recently discovered what may be the world's oldest calendar. 12,000 years. It depicts symbols that may represent 365 days in a year. 12 lunar months, 11 additional days. There are images of the sun, the constellation Scorpio, Ophiuchus. People observed the sky, tracked the movement of constellations, perhaps tried to predict seasons, understand when rain would come, when drought would begin, when herds of animals they hunted would migrate. And for all this, they needed a temple, a place where they could gather, where they could conduct observations, where they could pass knowledge from one generation to another. But to build such a temple required incredible efforts. Let's look at the numbers. Archaeologists calculated that some of the stone pillars weigh up to 50 tons. 50 tons. That's the weight of an average modern tank. And this stone had to be cut from rock, processed, reliefs carved on it, and then dragged to the construction site. Without horses, without oxen, without wheels, without any mechanisms at all. Only human muscle power. Researchers calculated that to move a 20-ton pillar a distance of 500 meters, and that's exactly how far it is from the quarry to the temple, required at least 500 people. 500. And for 50-ton pillars, even more people were needed. And this is just moving. And you still needed to cut the stone, process it, install it, secure it. This is months, maybe years of work. 500 people. Think about this number. For hunter-gatherers, this is unthinkable. A typical group is 20-30 people, maximum 50. There simply can't be more, because nature doesn't provide that many resources in one territory to feed a large group that only engages in hunting and gathering. But here, 500 people gathered, maybe even more, from different places, from different tribes. And they worked together, in coordination, under someone's leadership. And this is already a completely different level of social organization. Someone had to plan, someone had to say, you will go to the quarry and cut stone, you will drag it here, you will install it, you will carve images. Someone had to make sure everyone did their work. Someone had to resolve disputes, distribute food, organize this entire grand undertaking. That is, there had to be a leader or a group of leaders, religious chiefs perhaps, or military ones, and most likely both, and these leaders possessed power, real power. They could make hundreds of people do what they needed, work not for their own survival but for some higher purpose, for the gods, for the ancestors, for something sacred. And this means social hierarchy, inequality. Some people command, others obey. For the Mesolithic, for the era of hunter-gatherers, this is uncharacteristic. Usually such societies are egalitarian. That is, everyone is approximately equal. Of course, there are more experienced hunters. There are elders who are listened to. But there's no clear hierarchy. No power in the sense we understand it, but here it appeared. Earlier than agriculture. Earlier than cities. Earlier than everything we considered prerequisites for the emergence of complex societies. Some researchers even suggest that slave labor was used in the construction of Göbekli Tepe. Slavery among hunter-gatherers. This seems completely incredible, but how else to explain that so many people worked on such a grandiose project? Although perhaps this wasn't slavery in our understanding. Perhaps it was something like a duty, a religious obligation. People came, worked for some time because they considered it their duty before the gods, and then returned to their normal life. We don't know. We can only build guesses, but one thing is clear for sure. To build Göbekli Tepe society had to be organized completely differently than we're used to thinking about hunter-gatherer societies. Now let's talk about the temple itself, about what it looked like, what was there. Archaeologists distinguished three main layers on this hill, 3 levels of construction, if you will. The most ancient is layer number 3. Yes, they count from bottom to top, from ancient to newer. A bit confusing, but what can you do? Layer number 3 is the 10th millennium BC, maybe even earlier. And this is where the most impressive structures are located, round buildings, or oval, from 10 to 30 meters in diameter. A wall of unprocessed stone goes around, and inside are pillars, huge T-shaped pillars, some up to 3 meters high, and in the center of each circle, 2 even larger pillars. So far, 4 such circles have been excavated, but geophysical studies have shown that 16 more are hidden underground. 16. Can you imagine the scale? And this is considering that excavations are being conducted on only 5% of the territory. Klaus Schmidt, the head of excavations, said that studying this place will take another 50 years, if not more. And he specifically decided to leave most of the complex untouched for future generations of archaeologists who may possess more advanced research methods. This, by the way, is a very wise decision, because archaeology is a destructive science. When you excavate a layer, you destroy it. Yes, you record everything, photograph, write down. But the layer itself, the context of the find, it disappears forever. And if in 50 years, some new technologies appear that will allow extracting more information, they simply won't have such an opportunity if everything is already excavated. So most of Göbekli Tepe still lies underground, waiting for its time. But even what has already been excavated is breathtaking. The floors in these round structures were made of fired limestone. Can you imagine? They fired limestone. This requires high temperatures, special kilns. This is technology. Complex technology for Stone Age people. Along the walls stood low stone benches. Perhaps ceremony participants sat on them, or placed some offerings, and sculptures of boars, foxes. Not just images on walls, but 3-dimensional figures carved from stone. And the pillars? Oh, the pillars are a separate story. They are covered with reliefs, images of animals and abstract symbols, bulls, boars, foxes, lions. gazelles, snakes, even crocodiles, ants, scorpions, spiders, birds, especially many birds, vultures, ducks. Vultures are found most often. And this is very interesting, because there's a hypothesis about what such an abundance of vultures means. In these places there existed a special burial rite. The dead were not buried in the ground. They were left on the surface on special platforms, and vultures, well, you understand, vultures did their thing. This is called sky burial, and it was widespread in many ancient cultures. For example, among Zoroastrians, fire worshippers, such a custom existed until the 20th century. They built special towers of silence where they placed the bodies of the deceased. Why did they do this? Well, first of all, it's practical. In a hot climate, a body decomposes very quickly, and if you bury it shallow, it can be dangerous, the smell, diseases. And if you bury it deep, it requires great effort, especially if the soil is rocky. Vultures solved this problem naturally, but of course, it wasn't just about practicality. This was a religious rite. Perhaps people believed that the soul of the deceased rises to the sky with the vultures, to the gods, or to the ancestors. And after the vultures did their thing, only bones remained. And the bones were taken, especially the skulls. Skulls were kept separately as sacred relics. Ancestor cult. Veneration of the dead. This, by the way, was characteristic of the Natufian culture, which existed in this region a little earlier than Göbekli Tepe. The Natufians also kept the skulls of their ancestors, sometimes right under the floors of their dwellings. And on one of the pillars of Göbekli Tepe there is a very telling image. There is carved a figure of a headless person, and around him vultures, many vultures. This is not just a picture. This is perhaps a depiction of the rite itself, or a depiction of what a person turns into after death. Images of people in general at Göbekli Tepe are few, much fewer than images of animals, but those that exist are very interesting. On some T-shaped pillars, hands are carved, just hands, bent at the elbows. Perhaps this means that the pillars themselves are stylized images of people. The T-shaped form is the head and shoulders, and the hands show that this is not just stone, but something that represents a person, maybe an ancestor, maybe a god, maybe a hero from myths. We don't know. But this idea seems very beautiful to me. Imagine you enter the temple and you are surrounded by these huge stone figures. They stand in a circle like giants watching you, and hands are carved on them. And you understand these are not just stones. This is them. Ancestors, gods, those who were before you, those who created this world. And you stand before them, small and mortal, and feel simultaneously fear and awe. By the way, about symbols. On the pillars, there are not only images of animals and hands, there are also abstract signs, some pictograms, geometric figures. This is not writing, at least not in the sense that we understand writing now. These are not letters, not words, but these are definitely symbols. Signs that meant something to those people. Maybe these were sacred symbols used in rituals. Maybe these were totems of different tribes. Maybe these were some astronomical notations. We see similar symbols in other Neolithic cultures. That is, this was some common language of symbols, understandable to people of that time, over a large territory. Archaeologists found a huge number of flint artifacts in the temples, arrow points, scrapers, knives. All these are tools of hunters, and this once again confirms that this complex was built precisely by hunter-gatherers. No traces of domesticated animals were found in the most ancient layers, no grains of cultivated plants, only bones of wild animals, only wild seeds. But here's what's interesting. The construction of the complex continued for a very long time, thousands of years, and in later layers, which already date to the 8th to 9th millennia BC, signs of agriculture and animal husbandry appear. That is, people began building Göbekli Tepe as hunters and finished as farmers. And here, a very interesting hypothesis arises. What if it was precisely Göbekli Tepe that became the cause of agriculture arising? Think for yourself. Pilgrims come here. Many pilgrims. They need to be fed. Hunting and gathering is good, but it's unstable. Today you found a herd of gazelles, and tomorrow it's not there. Today fruits ripened on a tree, and tomorrow birds have already pecked them. But people need to be fed regularly, and many people. And so someone notices that near the hill, 30 kilometers away, on Mount Karakadag, wild wheat grows, very productive. And someone begins collecting its grains not only to eat, but also to plant near the temple, to have a supply. At first, this simply makes gathering easier. You don't need to walk 30 kilometers, everything grows nearby. But gradually, people notice that you can choose the best ears, sow them again, and with each generation, the wheat becomes better, more productive. And after some time, this is no longer wild wheat. This is cultivated wheat, domesticated. That is, agriculture did not lead to the appearance of temples, but on the contrary, the temple led to the appearance of agriculture. Religion changed economics. The sacred changed the practical. Of course, this is just a hypothesis, but a very beautiful hypothesis. And most importantly, it explains why precisely here, precisely in this region, the Neolithic revolution began. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and animal husbandry. That very transition that changed the entire course of human history. Because let's think about what the Neolithic revolution really is. It's not just a transition to a new way of obtaining food. It's a change in the entire way of life, the entire structure of society. The entire culture. Hunter-gatherers live in small groups. They are mobile. They move following resources. They don't have property in our understanding. Why do you need many things if you're constantly moving from place to place? They don't have accumulation of wealth. They have a relatively egalitarian society. And farmers are settled. They are tied to their land. They can't just take and leave because their fields remain here. They have property, houses, plots of land, grain reserves. They have accumulation. And accordingly, inequality. Someone has more land, someone less. Someone has a more fertile plot, someone less. And most importantly, agriculture requires planning. You can't just wake up in the morning and decide, I'll go sow wheat today. No, you must know when to sow, when to water, when to harvest. You must think months ahead, a whole year ahead. And this requires a different type of thinking, a different type of social organization. And imagine all this could have started here at Göbekli Tepe. Not because someone decided, let's try to grow wheat. It's convenient, but because pilgrims needed to be fed. The temple needed to be maintained. The gods needed to be served. That is, religion pushed economic changes. The spiritual changed the material. And this turns our usual scheme of civilization development upside down. We're used to thinking like this. First, people's economy improves, a surplus of resources appears, and only then do they start building temples, creating art, thinking about high matters. But here, everything is reversed. First the temple, first art, first religion, and the economy follows along, because the temple needs to be maintained. This makes us think, maybe we generally understand incorrectly, what drives the development of human society. Maybe it's not just about economics, not just about material needs. Maybe spiritual needs are no less important, and sometimes even more important. People don't just want to eat and sleep in warmth. People want to understand meaning, want to feel connection with something bigger than themselves, want to believe in something sacred. And for this, they are ready to drag 50-ton stones. For this, they are ready to work for years. For this, they are ready to invent new technologies, new ways of organizing labor, new forms of society. Göbekli Tepe shows us that humans are not only Homo economicus, economic humans. Humans are also Homo religiosus, religious humans. And this side of human nature is no less important for understanding our history. Now let's talk about what happened to Göbekli Tepe next. Construction and use of the complex continued for approximately 2,000 years, maybe even 2,500, from the 10th to the 8th millennium BC. This is a huge period. Imagine, from us to Christ passed 2,000 years. And here, 2,000 years of continuous religious tradition. Generation after generation came here, conducted their rituals, built new circles, carved new images. Later structures, which belong to layer number 2, already differ slightly from the most ancient ones. Round buildings are replaced by rectangular halls. Pillars become smaller. Stone processing is slightly less thorough. Perhaps this is connected with the fact that society was changing. Agriculture appeared, permanent settlements appeared. People no longer gathered in huge crowds several times a year. As before, maybe they lived near the temple permanently. And the temple was no longer such a grandiose pilgrimage center as it was at the beginning. And then, at the beginning of the 8th millennium BC, something happened. The temple complex was abandoned. But not simply abandoned, not simply left to gradually collapse under the influence of wind, rain, and time. No, it was intentionally buried. It was someone, we don't know who, brought here from 300 to 500 cubic meters of earth and stones and buried the entire complex completely, so that only a hill remained on the surface, an ordinary hill of which there are thousands in this area. And for 9,500 years, this place remained hidden until archaeologists began excavations in 1994. Why? What for? We don't know. We can only build guesses. Maybe this was a religious rite. Maybe the old gods died or left, and the temple needed to be buried with them, like burying a person. Maybe other people came with other beliefs, and they didn't want the old temple to remain. But at the same time, they didn't want to destroy it. It would be sacrilege, so they buried it, hid it, sealed it. Maybe some catastrophe happened, some event that made people think the gods were angry. And the temple needed to be hidden to appease the gods. There's even a hypothesis about a comet. In 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh studied symbols on one of the pillars and suggested they depict the position of celestial bodies. Comparing these symbols with a map of constellations of that time, they concluded that around the year 10,950 before Christ, a comet may have fallen to Earth. Remember that image of a headless person surrounded by vultures? Maybe this symbolizes not a burial rite, but numerous victims of that catastrophe. After the comet's fall came the so-called Younger Dryas, a period of sharp cooling that lasted about 1,000 years, from the end of the 11th to the end of the 10th millennium before Christ. Maybe people saw the comet fall, saw how the climate changed, and decided this was punishment from the gods, and built the temple to appease them. And then, 2,000 years later, when the gods still seemed angry, they decided to close the temple, seal it, bury it. This is just a hypothesis, one of many, but it captures the imagination right. Imagine people who survived a cosmic catastrophe carve the memory of it in stone. And this memory remains hidden underground for 12,000 years until we find it. What happened to the people who lived around Göbekli Tepe after the temple was buried? They didn't disappear. They didn't go anywhere. Their way of life simply changed. By the 8th millennium before Christ, permanent settlements already existed in this region. People built houses, grew wheat and barley, raised goats and sheep. This was already a different culture, the culture of pre-pottery Neolithic B. Yes, by the way, about pottery. Why pre-pottery Neolithic? Because the potter's wheel hadn't been invented yet. There was no ceramic dishes. They ate from stone bowls, from wood, from bottle gourds, maybe from woven baskets coated with clay. But real fired ceramics didn't exist yet. It will appear later, around the 7th millennium before Christ. And dwellings? What were they like? In Göbekli Tepe itself, as we remember, there were no dwellings, but nearby, in the same region, archaeologists find remains of settlements from that time. Houses were round or oval, walls of unprocessed stone bonded with clay, roof probably of branches and reeds coated with clay. Inside, a hearth, stone benches along the walls, depressions in the floor for storage, very simple dwellings, but already permanent. No longer temporary shelters, but real houses. And here's what's interesting. In these houses, they sometimes find burials. Right under the floors, people were buried in their own homes. Maybe so ancestors would remain nearby. Maybe so the spirit of the deceased would guard the dwelling. Maybe simply because that was the custom. Sometimes skulls were separated from bodies and kept separately. The ancestor cult continued. Where did these people go? Where did this culture go? It didn't go anywhere. It developed, transformed, spread. And about 1,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was buried, in the same region another amazing place appears. Another settlement that also overturns our ideas about the early Neolithic. This place is called Chatal Huyuk, but we'll talk about Chatal Huyuk a bit later. And now let's linger a bit more in Göbekli Tepe and think, what does this place mean for us? Why is it so important? Why do archaeologists say this discovery revolutionized our understanding of the early Neolithic? Because before the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, there existed a very clear scheme of civilization development. It was described in all textbooks. It seemed logical and justified. First, scientists said, people learned to grow plants and raise animals. This gave them a stable food source. A surplus of resources appeared. Settled life appeared. People began building permanent dwellings, villages. In villages, there were more people than surrounding fields could feed. Specialization appeared. Some grow food, others make tools, still others build houses. Trade appeared, social hierarchy appeared, chiefs, priests appeared, and only after all this, when society is already sufficiently complex and rich, do monumental structures appear, all logical, all sequential. First bread, then temples. And here comes Göbekli Tepe and says no. Everything was not like that. Or at least not always like that. Here the temple appeared first. Huge, complex, requiring colossal efforts. And agriculture appeared later. Maybe even as a consequence of the need to maintain this temple. And this changes everything. This makes us reconsider our basic ideas about how human society develops. It turns out that spiritual needs can be no less and sometimes even more important driving forces of development than material ones. That religion, art, striving for the sacred is not a superstructure over the economic base as Marx taught, but an independent force that can shape the economy. This is a very deep thought. And it has significance not only for understanding the past, but also for understanding the present. We live in a society that focuses very strongly on the material, on economics, on profit, on consumption. And sometimes it seems that this is the only thing that matters. That spiritual needs are something secondary, optional, that can be satisfied only after all material needs are satisfied. But Göbekli Tepe reminds us, no, people have always needed meaning. The sacred, connection with something bigger than themselves. And these needs are so strong that for them, people are ready to make incredible sacrifices. I think this is important to remember. Now, let's talk about what we still don't know about Göbekli Tepe, because there remain very many mysteries. First, we've excavated only 5% of the territory. Only 5%. 16 circles are still hidden underground, maybe even more. Who knows what's there? What images? What symbols? What artifacts? Second, we still don't fully understand the system of symbols used on the pillars. What do these abstract signs mean? Are these astronomical notations, totems, sacred symbols? Maybe this is an early form of writing that we simply don't know how to read. Third, we don't know exactly how the life of people who built and maintained this temple was organized. Where did they live? How far did they come? How long did they stay? Were there permanent cult servants among them? priests who lived here year-round? Or did everyone come only for the time of ceremonies? Fourth, we don't fully understand why the temple was buried. This remains one of the biggest mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. And finally, we don't know how unique Göbekli Tepe was. Was this the only such temple complex in the region, or were there more within it? We just haven't found them yet. Actually, there are grounds to think that Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Archaeologists have already found several other places with similar T-shaped pillars. True, they are smaller in size and not as well preserved, but they exist. This means that Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader culture. A culture that built such temples, a culture that used these symbols, a culture that had developed religion and social organization long before agriculture appeared. And this culture spread, influenced neighboring regions. Perhaps it was from this region, from this culture, that all Near Eastern civilization grew. Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, all of them, to some extent, are heirs of those people who built Göbekli Tepe. This, of course, is a very bold hypothesis. But it's not without foundation. Because look, it was precisely here, in this region called the Fertile Crescent, that the Neolithic revolution began. It was precisely here that the first grains were domesticated, wheat, barley. It was precisely here that the first animals were domesticated, goats, sheep. It was from here that agriculture and animal husbandry spread throughout the world. Why precisely here? Maybe because it was precisely here that a culture existed that created the prerequisites for this. A culture that knew how to organize large groups of people, a culture that had developed religion and social hierarchy. The culture of Göbekli Tepe. Let's now talk about Chatal Huyuk, because if Göbekli Tepe shows us the beginning of something new, then Chatal Huyuk shows us where all this led. Chatal Huyuk is located in modern Turkey in Anatolia. This is approximately 500 kilometers west of Göbekli Tepe, and it dates to approximately 7,500 to 5,500 years before Christ. That is, this is already 1,500 to 2,000 years later than Göbekli Tepe. And this is already a completely different place. This is not a temple complex where pilgrims come. This is a city, a real city, one of the oldest in the world. Imagine from 3,000 to 8,000 people lived here simultaneously. 3,000 to 8,000. This is a huge number for that time. For comparison, at Göbekli Tepe perhaps several hundred people gathered during ceremonies, and here several thousand lived permanently, and they lived in a very unusual way. Houses in Çatalhöyük stood close together, so tightly that there were no streets between them at all, no gaps. Imagine a giant hive where each cell is a house, and they're all connected to each other by walls. How did people get into their houses? Through the roof. Yes, through the roof. In each house there was an opening in the roof, and people descended inside by ladder. And they walked on the roofs like on streets. The roofs were flat, and life bustled on them. Food was cooked there, things were dried, children played, people met and communicated. Why so strange? Why not make normal streets? There are different versions. Maybe this was protection. If there are no streets, then it's difficult for an enemy to penetrate the city. He needs to climb on roofs, and there he's easy to notice and repel. The whole city becomes one big fortress. Maybe this was saving space. There wasn't much land for construction, and this way the maximum number of houses could be placed on minimum territory. Or maybe this was some religious or social principle. Maybe for these people it was important that all houses touch, that everyone be connected, that the city be a single organism, not a collection of separate buildings. We don't know for sure. But this is indeed a unique layout that wasn't found anywhere else in the world at that time. Inside the houses it was quite spacious. One large room, about 20 to 30 square meters, an oven in the corner, benches along the walls, shelves for storage. And what's very interesting, very many decorations on the walls, paintings, reliefs, images of animals, bulls, leopards, birds, images of people, geometric patterns. Some walls were completely covered with paintings. This was not just a dwelling, this was something like an art gallery. And one more very strange feature. Under the floors of houses they buried the dead. right under the floors, sometimes several people in one house. That is, you live, walk on the floor, cook food, sleep, and under you lie the bones of your ancestors. For us, this seems creepy, right? But for them, this was normal. Moreover, this was important. Ancestors remained with the family. They guarded the house. They were part of the life of the living. Sometimes, when burying a new person, the bones of previous ones were removed and reburied elsewhere. Sometimes skulls were separated and kept separately. They were even decorated, covered with clay, given facial features, painted. This is an ancestor cult that we already saw at Göbekli Tepe and in other places of that time. But in Çatalhöyük, it reaches special intensity. What did people do in Çatalhöyük? They grew wheat, barley, peas, raised sheep, goats, cattle. But at the same time, they still hunted. Hunting still played an important role in their life. On the walls of houses are many images of wild bulls that were clearly hunted and revered. They made pottery. By this time, pottery had already appeared. True, still quite simple, without a potter's wheel, hand-molded, but already fired, already real pottery. They processed obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass, very sharp. Knives, arrowheads, scrapers were made from it. And what's interesting, obsidian in Çatalhöyük is not local. It was brought from far away, maybe hundreds of kilometers. That is, trade already existed. Exchange over large distances. They made jewelry. Beads from stone, from shells, from bones. Bracelets, pendants. People decorated themselves, wanted to be beautiful. And they created art, lots of art, not only paintings on walls, but also small statuettes, especially many statuettes of women. Full-figured, with large breasts and wide hips. These are so-called mother goddess figurines, symbols of fertility. One of the most famous is a statuette of a woman sitting on a throne, on the sides of which are two leopards, a goddess ruling over wild nature, maybe the main deity of this people. But let's return to the city structure. This dense development, these houses without windows, these entrances through roofs, all this created a very special atmosphere. Inside such a house, it was dark. The only light came through the opening in the roof. And smoke from the hearth also went out the same way. Imagine semi-darkness, flickering fire, smell of smoke, and on the walls, these huge images of bulls, leopards, vultures. This was not just a dwelling. This was a sacred space. Each house was simultaneously a home and a temple, and under the floor, ancestors. Always nearby, always present in the family's life. Archaeologists calculated that on average under the floor of each house there were from 5 to 8 burials. This is several generations of one family. Imagine you live in a house where your parents lived, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and they are all here, under your feet. This creates a completely different sense of time, a different attitude toward history. The past is not somewhere far away. The past is here, next to you. It's part of your home, part of your everyday life. And one more interesting detail. Houses in Çatalhöyük were periodically renovated. Walls were replastered. Sometimes new paintings were applied over old ones. And when a house completely deteriorated, it wasn't demolished. It was filled in from the inside, leveled. And a new house was built right on top, in the same exact place. That is, the city grew not in width, but in height. New layers of houses were built on top of old ones. Over the 1,500 years of Çatalhöyük's existence, 18 such layers accumulated. 18 levels of the city, one above another. Archaeologists call this a tell, an artificial mound formed by layers of successive settlements. And Çatalhöyük is one of the most impressive tells in the world. Why did people do this? Why not just build a new house nearby? Maybe because the land was sacred, because ancestors are buried here, and you couldn't leave this place. You needed to stay here, build here, live here. Or maybe it was simply the custom. Fathers did it this way, grandfathers did it this way, so we will do it this way too. Tradition is a very powerful thing, especially in societies where there is no writing, where knowledge is transmitted orally from generation to generation. How the ancestors did it becomes sacred. This is the right way, the only way. Çatalhöyük existed for approximately 1,500 years, from 7,500 to 5,500 years before Christ. This is a huge period, longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Islam has existed. 1,500 years of continuous life in one place, and then the city was abandoned. Why, we don't know exactly. Maybe the climate changed and the land became less fertile. Maybe resources were exhausted. Maybe some conflict happened, some catastrophe. People left, and the city turned into a mound, into a tell. And for 9,000 years it stood, hiding this amazing civilization beneath it, until in 1958, British archaeologist James Mellaart began excavations here, and the world learned about the existence of Çatalhöyük. And again, as with Göbekli Tepe, this discovery changed our understanding of the early Neolithic. It turns out people could live in large cities long before writing, metals, the wheel appeared. They could create complex art. They could trade over large distances. They could build cities with unique layouts. And most striking, no signs of social hierarchy were found in Çatalhöyük. All houses are approximately the same size. There are no palaces, no temples separate from dwellings, no rich quarters and poor quarters, no traces of violence, very few bones with injuries from weapons, no fortifications around the city. It turns out that 8,000 people lived together in this strange city without streets, and at the same time they had a relatively egalitarian society, without obvious chiefs, without kings, without priests who lived in luxury while others worked. How is this even possible? How can you organize the life of 8,000 people without clear hierarchy? We don't know. This is one of the mysteries of Çatalhöyük. Maybe hierarchy still existed, but it wasn't expressed in material wealth. Maybe there were religious leaders, elders who were respected but lived the same as everyone else. Maybe power was distributed somehow differently, not through wealth, not through force, but through knowledge, through rituals, through kinship ties. Or maybe this really was a society without pronounced hierarchy, where decisions were made collectively, where everyone was approximately equal. This is very unusual for that time. And this makes us think maybe there wasn't just one path to civilization. Maybe it's not necessary that first inequality appeared, then kings and priests, then cities and states. Maybe there were other options, other ways to organize a large society. Çatalhöyük shows us that yes, there were, at least for some time. For 1,500 years, people managed to live in a large city without obvious hierarchy. True, then it ended. The city was abandoned, and the next civilizations that appear in this region will already have kings, temples, social hierarchy. But the very fact that such a thing was possible is very important. It shows that human history is not predetermined, that there isn't one single path of development, that people tried different options, experimented, searched for different ways to organize their lives. And some of these experiments were amazing. Let's now think, what connects Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük? What common features do we see? First, both places show the incredible importance of religion and rituals. At Göbekli Tepe, a grandiose temple complex. At Çatalhöyük, each house is a temple. Walls covered with sacred images, ancestors buried under the floor. Spiritual life was the center of these people's existence. Not just an addition to material life, but the center. Second, both places show ancestor cult. At Göbekli Tepe, sky burials and keeping skulls. At Çatalhöyük, burials under house floors, decorated skulls. Connection with the deceased was very important. Ancestors didn't go to some other world. They stayed here with the living. They were part of the family, part of the community. Third, both places show amazing art. Reliefs on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, paintings and sculptures of Çatalhöyük. People created beauty. They wanted to surround themselves not just with functional things, but with things that have meaning, that tell stories, that connect them with the world of spirits, with the world of gods. Fourth, both places show the ability to organize large numbers of people. At Göbekli Tepe, for temple construction. At Chatal Huyuk, for living together in a city. And this required some forms of social organization, maybe not as rigid as in later civilizations with kings and priests, but still some. People had to negotiate, make joint decisions, distribute responsibilities, resolve conflicts, and it seems they coped with this quite successfully. Otherwise, neither Göbekli Tepe nor Çatalhöyük could have existed so long. There's one more interesting connection between these places, symbols. In both places, we see images of bulls, many images of bulls. Huge, powerful, with large horns. The bull was clearly an important symbol for these cultures. Maybe this was a sacred animal, maybe a symbol of strength, fertility, maybe even an embodiment of some god. We also see images of leopards, vultures, snakes. These are animals that in later cultures are often associated with gods, with the other world. That is, already in this early period, some system of symbols is forming, some mythology that will then pass into later cultures. For example, we will see the bull cult later in Crete, in Minoan civilization. The cult of the mother goddess with leopards we will see in many cultures of the Near East and Mediterranean. That is what originated here in Anatolia in the 10th to 7th millennia before Christ, did not disappear without a trace. It was passed on. It influenced other cultures. And possibly many things that we consider characteristic of later civilizations, temples, art, complex symbolism, ancestor cult, actually have their roots here in these most ancient cultures. Let's now try to imagine what all this looked like in reality. How did these people live? How did their ordinary day go? Imagine you live in Çatalhöyük. Morning. You wake up on a bench by the wall. The house is semi-dark. Only weak light comes through the opening in the roof. The hearth went out overnight, and you need to light it again. You climb the ladder to the roof, and you find yourself in a completely different world. Bright sun, clear sky, and around you roofs. Hundreds of roofs, flat like platforms. Life is already bustling on them. Women cook food on open hearths. Children run and play. Men repair tools, process hides. This is your street. The roof is the street. You walk across the roofs to the well, draw water, return. Descend back into the house through the opening in the roof. Light the hearth. Prepare simple food, flatbreads from wheat flour, maybe some porridge. If you were lucky hunting yesterday, there's meat. After breakfast, you need to go to work. Maybe you go to the field located outside the city. There you grow wheat, barley. Or maybe you're a shepherd and you need to take goats to pasture. Or maybe you're a craftsman. You stay in the city and make ceramic pots, or process obsidian, make sharp knives and arrowheads from it, or weave baskets, or sew clothes from leather and fabric. The day passes in work. In the evening, you return home. Again, climb to the roof. Again, descend through the opening. Prepare dinner. Eat with the whole family. And then, when it gets dark, you light a lamp, a small stone bowl with fat and a wick. And in the flickering light of this lamp, the room transforms. Shadows dance on the walls, images of bulls and leopards seem to come alive. You sit on the floor, and right below, you are the bones of your ancestors. Your grandmother who died 3 years ago. Your grandfather whom you never knew, but about whom you heard a lot. Your great-great-grandfather whose name is almost forgotten, but he's still here, under the floor of your house. And at this moment, past, present, and future merge into one. You are not just a separate person living your small life. You are a link in a long chain. You continue what your ancestors began, and your children will continue what you began. This feeling of continuity, connection of generations, it was very strong in that culture, much stronger than we have now. We live in a world where everything changes quickly, where each generation lives completely differently from the previous one, where traditions are easily discarded if they seem inconvenient or outdated. And for the people of Çatalhöyük, tradition was everything. To do as ancestors did was not just a habit. It was a sacred duty. And maybe this is exactly what allowed their society to exist so long and so stably, this connection with the past, this respect for tradition. Of course, such an approach has downsides. A society too attached to traditions can freeze, stop developing, fail to adapt to new conditions. And maybe this is exactly what eventually happened to Çatalhöyük. Conditions changed, climate, resources, something else, and society couldn't change quickly enough. And the city was abandoned, but 1,500 years is very, very long. This is success. This shows that their way of organizing society worked, at least for some time. Now let's look at the broader picture. Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük are not isolated phenomena. In this region, in Anatolia and the Near East, a lot of interesting things were happening at that time. Other settlements appeared. Jericho, for example, which is considered one of the oldest cities in the world, it appeared approximately at the same time as the early layers of Göbekli Tepe, about 10,000 years ago. In Jericho, they also find burials with separated skulls covered with clay and painted. That is, the ancestor cult was widespread in this region. Agriculture appeared. Plants were domesticated, wheat, barley, peas, lentils. Animals were domesticated, goats, sheep, pigs, later cattle. This was a real revolution, the Neolithic revolution, as scientists call it. The transition from appropriating economy, hunting and gathering, to producing economy, agriculture and animal husbandry. And this transition changed everything. It changed where people live. It changed how many people can live together. It changed social structure. It changed culture, religion, worldview. And all this happened here in this region called the Fertile Crescent, a strip of land that arcs from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia, along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and further into Anatolia. Why precisely here? Why did the Neolithic revolution begin precisely in this region? There are many factors. The climate was favorable, not too hot, not too cold, enough rain. Wild ancestors of cultivated plants grew here, wheat, barley. Wild ancestors of domestic animals lived here, wild goats, wild sheep, wild bulls. That is, people had the necessary resources to begin experiments with domestication. But I think there was one more important factor. Culture, religion, what we see at Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük. These people already knew how to organize. They already knew how to work together on large projects. They already had developed symbolic culture, developed religion, and maybe this is exactly what allowed them to take the next step, transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, from small nomadic groups to large settled settlements, from simple societies to complex ones. Of course, this didn't happen instantly. This was a long process stretched over thousands of years, with rollbacks, with experiments, with mistakes. But in the end, it led to the appearance of what we call civilization. Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, all of them grew from these early Neolithic cultures. And when we look at the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, we must remember, all this began here, with hunter-gatherers who decided to build a temple on a hill in Anatolia, with farmers who lived in a strange city without streets and buried ancestors under the floors of their houses. This is important to understand because it changes our perspective. We often think of civilization as something that appeared suddenly, bam, and here are already cities, writing, states. But actually, this was a slow, gradual process. Thousands of years of experiments, thousands of years of trial and error, thousands of years when people learned to live together in large groups, learned to organize, learned to create complex societies. And Göbekli Tepe with Çatalhöyük are important milestones on this path. They show us intermediate stages. They show how this happened. let's draw some conclusions. What did we learn from these amazing discoveries? First, we learned that monumental construction can appear before agriculture. That temples can be built by hunter-gatherers. That religion and art are not a superstructure over economics, but independent and very powerful forces that can shape society's development. Second, we learned that social organization can take very different forms, that there don't necessarily have to be kings and priests to organize large numbers of people, that relatively egalitarian societies are possible even in large cities. Third, we learned about the importance of ancestor cult in early societies, about how connection with the deceased shaped people's worldview, their attitude toward time, toward history, toward their place in the world. Fourth, we saw that the transition to civilization was not linear, not a one-directional process, that there were different options, different experiments, that some societies went one way, others another, that some experiments were successful for some time and then ended. And this is probably the most important lesson. Human history is not a straight line from simple to complex, from savagery to civilization. This is a tree with many branches. This is an experiment with many options. This is a search in which there is no one correct answer. People tried different ways to live together, different ways to organize society, different ways to relate to the world, to gods, to ancestors, to each other. And each of these experiments teaches us something, even those that ultimately didn't succeed. Çatalhöyük was abandoned, Göbekli Tepe was buried, but they left a trace. They influenced the cultures that came after them. They showed what was possible. And for us, people of the 21st century, these ancient places have special significance. We live in an era when very much is changing very quickly, when old ways of organizing society stop working, when we are searching for new paths, and knowledge that our distant ancestors also searched, also experimented, also tried different options, this knowledge can be very valuable. It reminds us that there is no one single correct way to arrange society, that different options are possible, that we can learn from the past, but are not obliged to repeat it, that we, like those people 12,000 years ago, have the right to experiment, search for new paths, try what hasn't been tried before. Of course, we cannot return to the way of life of Chatal Huyuk. We will not bury ancestors under the floors of our houses. We will not enter houses through roofs. But we can take something important from their experience, their connection with ancestors, their respect for tradition, their ability to live in large communities relatively peacefully and without rigid hierarchy. We can think about what is truly important to us, what we want to pass on to future generations, what kind of society we want to build. And in this sense, Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük are not just archaeological monuments. This is a mirror into which we can look. These are questions that these ancient people ask us from the depths of millennia. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is truly important in human life? How should we live together? And maybe the most amazing thing about these places is that they make us ask these questions. They remind us that we are part of a long history, that before us there were other people who also thought, dreamed, built, created, and that after us there will be other people who perhaps in 10,000 years will excavate our cities, study our artifacts, and try to understand who we were, how we lived, what we dreamed about. What will they think of us? What will they see in our ruins? Will they see a society that managed to live in peace, or a society that destroyed itself? Will they see art, beauty, striving for the sacred, or only consumption, destruction, greed? This depends on us, on what choices we make now, on what we build, what we create, what we leave behind. The people of Göbekli Tepe left behind a temple, a grandiose, incredible temple that stood for thousands of years and still amazes us with its beauty and scale. The people of Çatalhöyük left behind a city, a strange, unique city where 8,000 people lived together for 1,500 years. What will we leave behind? I hope we will leave behind something good, something that future generations can be proud of, something that will show that we also strived for something greater than just survival, that we also searched for meaning, that we also created beauty. Because in the end, this is exactly what distinguishes humans. Not just the ability to survive, not just the ability to adapt, but the ability to create, the ability to dream, the ability to believe in something greater than ourselves. 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in Anatolia decided to build a temple. Why? We don't know exactly, but they did it. They gathered together, hundreds of people, and dragged huge stones, carved images on them, created sacred space. This was not necessary for survival. This didn't give them more food. This didn't protect them from predators, but it was important. Important for their spirit. Important for their understanding of the world. Important for their connection with each other and with something greater. And I think this is a lesson we can take from Göbekli Tepe. A lesson that the spiritual is as important as the material. That meaning is as important as food. That beauty is as important as utility. In our modern world, we often forget about this. We are so focused on economics, on production, on consumption, that we forget about other things. About beauty, about meaning, about the sacred. But people have always needed this, and always will need it. We need temples. Not necessarily in the literal sense, not necessarily religious temples, but in places and moments when we can touch something greater than everyday life, beauty, art, nature, history, mystery. We need connection with ancestors, understanding where we came from, respect for those who were before us. We need community, the ability to live together, work together, create together something greater than each of us could create alone. All this was present in the people of Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, and all this should be present in us. Of course, we cannot simply copy their way of life. The world has changed. We have changed. We have different problems, different opportunities, different technologies, but the principles remain the same. The need for meaning, the need for beauty, the need for connection with the past, with other people, with something greater than ourselves. And when we study these ancient places, we are not just studying the dead past. We are studying a living tradition. We are studying how people over millennia tried to answer the same eternal questions. Who are we? Why are we here? How should we live? And maybe their answers will help us find our own answers. So we have traveled a long way from hunter-gatherers descending from trees in African savannas 7 million years ago to builders of the first temples and cities 12,000 years ago. We saw how humans developed, how speech appeared, how the first tools were made, how fire was tamed, how the first large communities formed, how social hierarchy arose, how agriculture appeared. We saw Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple complex in the world, built by hunter-gatherers. We saw Chatal Huyuk, a strange city without streets where thousands of people lived together in relative equality. And we saw that the path to civilization was not straight, not simple, not one-directional. That there were many experiments, many options, many paths. And this path continues. We are still experimenting, still searching, still trying to understand how we can best live together. The history of civilization has not ended. It continues, and we are part of it. Thank you for being with me on this journey through millennia. I hope it was interesting. I hope it made you think. I hope it showed you that the past is not something dead and boring. It is alive. It is important. It is part of us. Until we meet again in history.